Chapter 1. The little owl soared over the dense forest. Scanning for prey, he thought his eye caught movement below. A serpent was slithering along the low branch of a tree toward a bird's nest. As the owl watched from his vantage point high above, the serpent raised his head and opened his mouth. It eyed the eggs in the nest and prepared to grab one in its fanged maw. Diving, the owl plummeted toward the serpent, his talons outstretched before him. Immediately before striking, he let his excitement get the better of him and let out a squawk. It was a mistake. The dark gray serpent was quick to react, faster than the young bird could have imagined possible. It dodged the talons and struck back at the owl, who shrieked in surprise as he dodged the deadly maw. The serpent's fangs had already penetrated the egg. Now, as they fought, the serpent's tail struck the damaged egg. As this flew into the sky over the owl's head, bits of yolk hit the owl in the eyes, blinding him. The fight was on, and the owl and serpent continued to strike at one another. Each avoided the counter-strikes of the other. The snake lashed out, looping and coiling its long body, seeking to wrap itself around the deadly bird. As they fought, the owl caught glimpses of faint images through the gaps in the serpent's coils. A beautiful wood elf maiden with dark hair and loose clothing of a light color worked in a desert field. A strong cat man with mottled fur crept through an unfamiliar landscape. A pair of very sharp daggers, made of the shiniest metal, floated free and unconnected. As these images faded, so did the strength of the serpent. The owl soon managed to score the side of his head with deep scratches from his talons. Excited at the prospect of impending victory, the owl committed himself to the attack. He was intent on finishing the serpent once and for all. When the owl swept his talons toward his enemy in an intended death blow, though, the serpent recoiled. The owl's talons instead went deep into the branches of the white bark of the tree and became lodged there. The owl tried to pull back, now in a state of panic, but his talons had become lodged in the wood. The serpent wasted no time taking advantage of the situation and sunk his fangs deep into the neck of the owl. Shrieking in pain and terror, the owl tried in vain to pull free, but the poison was already doing its work. The owl's sight began to dim as the world began to slip into darkness. As he jerked awake, covered in sweat, Nox screamed and gasped for air. "A dream! It was only a dream." Speaking to himself, the young wood elf slowed his breathing. As he did, he flipped over onto his back on his sleeping mat. Why did that feel so real? Nox frowned. He'd had plenty of vivid dreams in the past, but this one had been particularly so. And why an owl? Was it because of his name? Nox Lan, which was his full name, meant little owl. Was that why he had dreamed of being one? He shook his head. He was about to roll over and go back to sleep when he heard footsteps approaching. "Nox, it's time to wake up. I have your breakfast." Nox sighed. It was his aunt who had raised him after his parents died. She was an early riser and had insisted on instilling the same discipline in her nephew. Usually, Nox didn't mind getting up early in the morning and loved watching the sunrise. On some mornings, though, like today, he wasn't feeling it. "Couldn't I sleep for a few more minutes, Aunt Winoka?" Nox was grumpy as he spoke, while sitting up, stretching and tossing aside his blanket. His aunt pulled back the skin covering the opening of their batza, or home. This was a little hut of sticks and animal skins. She smiled at him as she entered, holding a pot she had retrieved from the fire. Now, my little Tashatsu. You're fishing today and will need an early start. Now eat your breakfast and then get dressed." She reached down and tousled his hair as she said this, then lightly kissed his lips. "Oh well, it's not like I wasn't already awake anyway," he thought as he stood up and scowled at his aunt. She waited, holding a bowl with his breakfast, a patient look about her. "You know, Auntie, I wish you wouldn't call attention to my hair like that." "What's wrong with your hair, and why shouldn't I compliment it? It makes you look handsome." Smiling, she handed Nox the bowl of mush, made from kise. The grain, with kernels of various colors, was a staple crop for his people. Nox paused as he took the bowl and gathered his thoughts, frowning a bit as he continued. You might think of it as a compliment, Auntie, but the boys in the village mean to insult me when they call me Toshatsu.
That's ridiculous.
Wainoka's voice took on a harsh tone as Nox ate his mush.
There's nothing wrong with having light hair. Your grandmother had light hair too, and your father had a shock of white running through his dark hair. It's all part of your heritage, you know, and nothing shameful. I've told you all about your great-grandparents, right?
Yes, many times. Nox sighed as he grabbed his bembatsa, the loincloth of soft leather worn by males of his tribe. Tying the belt around his waist, he looped the other part, a strip of leather, over the belt in the front and back. As he did so, he scowled at his aunt, and she smiled.
And?
Nox groaned. Was she going to make him repeat everything again? Shaking his head, he started to strap on his leggings, which is people called dalbatsa, as he responded. My great-grandfather was a world traveler, and he met my great-grandmother to the far north. She was a Mani, and that's why I have the light hair that I do. I wish I wasn't part snow elf, though, since it makes me stand out and look different. Wainoka now placed one hand on Nox's shoulder and looked him in the eye.
Nox, you shouldn't pay any mind to what people say. Boys like to make fun of anything that's different, but it's our differences that define us and make us who we are. If you were like everyone else, you wouldn't be unique.
Nox shook his head. I don't want to be unique. I want to be normal. He pulled away and began to put on his wawabatsa, the soft boots worn by his people. Wainoka smiled at him as he put the cord with a stylized owl amulet bearing his Teshdenawacha around his neck.
No, Nox, you're not normal, and I would never want you to be. Normal is boring.
As he picked up his spear, Wainoka wrapped her arms around him in an embrace and whispered in his ear,
I've noticed Jaya looking at you, and I know you like her. Why don't you invite her to the festival this evening? The future Via would be a good match for you, you know.
Nox felt like he was about to die on the inside. Why couldn't his aunt mind her own business? He knew she meant well, though, so he didn't explode, instead answering her in a low mumble. Maybe I'll ask her. Anyway, I better go. Nox rushed outside before his aunt could embarrass him any further. Looking around, he could see the village coming to life. The sun was already up, he noted, so his aunt had actually let him sleep in a bit later than usual. Toward the center of the village, he could see the large sawabatsa, or council tent, next to which sat the wubatsa, or sweat lodge. Several council members ran from the sweat lodge to the creek to bathe. The smell of baking dashka reached his nose. The flatbread made his mouth water, despite the fact that he'd already had breakfast. A creek ran through the village nearby, and a couple of the women were washing clothes. Nearby, some of the village boys and girls splashed and played in the water. Nox felt tempted to join them, but he had a task to do. His aunt's batsa was at the edge of the village, overlooking it on a hill, and right on the edge of the forest. Because of this, he didn't have long to take in the sights of the village until it was behind him. Soon he was walking the path through the woods toward the river. As he walked, he admired the wildlife. The woods teemed with deer and other game. If he'd had his bow, the temptation to forget about fishing and hunt instead would have been strong. He was not a very good shot, though, and he had left his bow at home today in favor of his spear. Before long, he was at the river. Again, he sighed. Atunoihan was already here. He knew he was in for a tongue-lashing due to how much past dawn it was. Sure enough, Atu paused after casting his net and scowled at Nox.
Lan, I see you finally made it. Are you well rested now that you've slept half the morning?
Nox ignored his older half-brother and removed his garments so as not to get them wet. Working in and around the water didn't mix well with wearing leather, so it was customary for males in their tribe to simply wear nothing at all for tasks such as this. Keeping his Teshtanawaka on its cord around his neck as his only adornment, he grabbed the other net and went to work. As he cast his net, Atu tried again to rile him.
I don't know why Wainoka pampers you so much. You can't do anything right. Of course I had to be stuck with you today, little brother. You're more likely to scare the fish than help catch them. I'm tempted to send you back home, but Heskevian wants me to mentor you, as if such a thing were possible."
Nox had pulled in the net and caught a couple of fish by this time, so he held up the string of fish and smiled as he replied,
"I can catch fish, Atu. I can. See? That will show him,"
Nox thought. Sure, the fish weren't particularly large, but that was the location, right? His face fell, though, as Atu held up a string of at least a dozen fish, all far bigger than his catch. His brother had a smirk on his face. Atu reattached his line to a tree root and lowered the fish on the line back into the water on the edge of the river. As he did so, he shook his head.
"Why the chief thought you would be good at this task escapes me, Lan."
Nox scowled. Atu's continued use of the diminutive Lan was starting to get on his nerves. He turned toward Atu, gritting his teeth.
"Call me Nox."
Atu laughed.
"To me, you'll only ever be little."
He leaned in next to Nox and lowered his voice, a look of gleeful sadism on his face.
"Oh, I hear you're sweet on Jaya."
Nox frowned. He hadn't gone around telling people he had a crush on Jaya. He looked up at Atu with a frown.
"How do you know?"
Atu laughed again, harder this time.
"You think it's a big secret? Oh, you can't keep your eyes off her whenever she's around. Everyone in the village knows."
Atu now lowered his voice.
"Can't blame you. She's a sweet morsel, but she's likely to be Chelanavia's replacement."
Nox frowned. He knew Jaya was training to replace the Viha, or medicine woman.
"Of course I know. So what? Even if she becomes a Viha, she can still marry and have a family. You know that, Atu."
Atu nodded, but in a dismissive manner.
"Oh, yes. She can marry, but you think she'll marry you. There's a reason most don't marry unless it's outside the tribe. Also, why would a powerful woman, even a superstitious Viha, pick a loser like you, Lan?"
Nox was furious, and it was all he could do not to lose control and throw himself at Atu right now. He wanted to strangle him. Instead, he slowed his breathing and tried his best to regain his control of his emotions. It might even have worked if Atu had left well enough alone. Instead, his brother leaned in over his shoulder and spoke in a whisper. As he spoke, he gestured toward Nox's line of fish in the water, which still only had about 6 or 7 small fish.
"Oh, and I see the rest of your catch is pitiful as well. Fortunately, I've made up for it. I always knew you were useless, and this confirms it. You'll never amount to anything but a joke."
That did it. Nox dropped his net as he balled up his fist and turned to face his brother.
"You're such a bim, Atu. Oh, language, Lan. What would Aunt Wainoka say?"
His anger boiling over, Nox charged at Atu and swung his fist toward his half-brother's face with all his might. Unfortunately for Nox, his brother had 10 more years of life experience. Atu had been in far more fights in his life. Without breaking a sweat, Atu grabbed Nox's arm and flipped him into the river. Nox had no time to catch his breath before he went under. The water wasn't deep, and Nox managed to press his feet to the river bottom. His bare feet landed on the river bottom. His toes dug into the pebbles, and he pushed off. He burst from the water like a leaping fish as he gasped for breath, only for something to hit him in the face. Blinking, he wiped the water from his eyes and realized that it was his loincloth that struck him. Atu had thrown it at him, and it now floated in the water, completely soaked.
"Titsikya kenemakyakin!"
Nox balled his fists up and was about to rush Atu again as he cursed, but then he heard footsteps approaching. He paused and listened, intent on finding out what was approaching. He didn't have to wait long, as Jaya emerged onto the riverbank. Nox couldn't help staring at what he saw as embodied perfection. Jaya was 17, the same age as Nox, but she already appeared like a grown woman. Nox, though, looked young for his age. The young wood elf woman was wearing clothing that was typical for the Tikyanwatik tribe. Her boots were quite like Nox's, but her hachpatsa, the loincloth worn by Tikyanwatik females, was of a different design. It provided a bit more coverage, though it left her legs and the sides of her hips bare. Above the waist she wore only a kenimbatsa. This piece of clothing wrapped her breasts and held them in place, but covered nothing else. Knox wondered what she looked like without the garment. He'd seen nursing women in the village who went without an upper garment while weaning the young, of course. He also knew a couple viha, or medicine women, from other clans wore only necklaces above the waist. He figured Jaya looked more like the younger females he'd seen, with high and firm breasts, not saggy ones. He shrugged. Even when he and Jaya swam together, for the past few years she'd always worn the upper garment with her loincloth. Both garments were heavy linen, which dried in a very short time and kept its shape without shrinking. He hadn't seen her without the garment since they were children, before her breasts began to bud. That was the age at which most girls began to wear the upper garment, though some waited until betrothal. Knox's clothing, unlike Jaya's, was of leather. He scowled as he looked again at his wet garment floating in the water. He was about to pick it up when he realized Jaya was talking, and he focused instead on her words.
Vihan summons you to the tribal council.
Atu's expression was serious.
Did they say what it was about?
Jaya shook her head.
They didn't, but there were loud noises in the woods to the north. I imagine it's about that.
Atu grunted, grabbed his strings of fish, and rushed off. Knox scowled. His brother had gotten such a big head since taking his place on the council 3 years earlier. Snorting, he picked up his loincloth from the water, squeezing the water out as he waded onto the shore. He groaned.
I hate getting my membatsa soaked. It always shrinks too.
Jaya turned and smiled at him.
No time to swim while it dries, I'm afraid, Knox. Too bad. I enjoy it when we're able to swim together.
Jaya now smiled.
At least the water appears to be not as cold as the other day when we went swimming.
Knox had started to piss against a nearby tree, and his eyes now widened a bit as he realized what she was getting at. He didn't know what to say. He scowled at Jaya as he finished relieving himself and put his wet loincloth back on. He next put on his boots and then picked up his leggings. He was about to put them on as well when Jaya gave him a curious look.
Wearing dalbatsa today, Knox?
He bristled.
Yeah, so what?
She smiled and shrugged.
It's not like your pathfinding today. I don't know why you bother with them. For that matter, I don't know why you bothered wearing anything today since you're fishing.
Knox pursed his lips as he considered her words. It was true. The path between the river and the village was well cleared of thorns and brambles. It wasn't as if he needed protection for his legs. If he'd thought about it, he would indeed have left his clothing at home, as Atu had. He'd only gotten fully dressed this morning out of habit, after all. Still, he was finding her particularly annoying at the moment. With a scowl, he continued to tie his dalbatsa in place, then reached to retrieve his line. Jaya smiled as she saw this.
So, Knox, not much luck fishing today?
Knox had always had a hard time talking to Jaya, since he had a tendency to get tongue-tied when speaking to her. Today, though, he was already in a bad mood from his interactions with Atu. Now it seemed as though the girl he liked was mocking him. He lost his temper.
Why must everyone belittle me, Jaya? Why can't people accept me for who I am?
Turning, he began to walk down the forest path back to the village at a brisk pace, leaving Jaya behind him. She rushed to catch up, placing a hand on his shoulder to get his attention. He turned and snapped at her.
What?
I accept you, Knox. Knox wasn't sure he believed her. He wanted to, but he'd had it with a teasing manner.
Do you? Do you really?
Sure I do.
Then why put me down all the time? The other day when we swam together, you pointed at me and giggled. You said, Vemki Sweta. You reminded me again a moment ago with your cute remark about the water temperature.
Jaya now took Knox by the arm, her touch tender against his bare skin. Knox wanted to be angry at her, but he found his anger melting away. He stopped for a moment and turned toward her. She now reached up and placed her hand against the side of his face.
I was just teasing. Knox, I didn't mean to hurt you.
Knox started walking again, and Jaya walked next to him as they reached the village. After a moment, Knox spoke again.
Everyone likes to make fun of me. I don't like it, especially when you start making fun of me too. Knox, you're so emotional, and let teasing get to you, but Most of it is good-natured ribbing from people who like you. Trust me. Anyway, about the other day, I thought your little Bem made you look cute, that's all.
At that moment they passed the creek. A bunch of the children from the village were swimming there, as they had been earlier. All were barefoot. Most of the older girls wore loincloths and chest wraps, like Jaya, though some also wore no upper garment. This was also true of the younger girls. The boys wore nothing at all, as was typical for males of their tribe. As Nox and Jaya approached, a couple of the boys, who were about Nox's age, laughed. One of them, whom Nox knew as Avunakan, pointed at Nox's white hair.
Bosak Taxitolan!
Avunakan and Takeoman both ran out of the creek and followed after Nox and Jaya for a moment, shouting the phrase over and over. I see little light hair. I see little light hair. Nox turned toward Jaya and gave her a look as if to say, You were saying? Jaya leaned in close to Nox and smiled as she whispered in his ear,
Don't worry, your hair is quite nice. Besides, while in truth I don't think you're a Bem, Lanataba, I do think these boys have en baksana kiswenata.
Nox laughed.
Like tiny grapes.
Jaya grinned, running ahead of him. Nox continued to smile as they dropped off the fish with some of the village women. The women were also cleaning game the hunters had brought back for the festival that evening. He smiled, thinking that things could work out with Jaya after all. Rushing to catch up with her, he decided to give it a shot.
Jaya, I've been meaning to ask you.
Nox paused, noticing they were near the pens where the trainers broke dreadcocks. These birds, which Vietka traveling merchants called roosters, made excellent war mounts.
Yes?
A flash of movement distracted Nox as one of the dreadcocks tried to behead a trainer with a swipe of its spurs. The trainer jumped backward while pulling a lever that activated a pulley system. A cord attached to the leg of the dreadcock was now pulled upward. Nox smiled now as one of the large birds flipped upside down. It squawked in anger but looked quite ridiculous. Turning back toward Jaya, he focused on his conversation with her.
Would you, maybe, consider going with me to the festival this evening?
Jaya smiled as she looked at him, twirling a bit of her hair around a finger.
Well, let me think.
Turning, she started to walk away from him, her hips swaying back and forth a bit as she walked. Looking back over her shoulder at him, she gave him a coy smile.
I may go with your brother Attu. He hasn't asked me yet, but...
Nox was crestfallen. Of course she would prefer his brother over him. Attu was 10 years older and was a member of the council after all. Lowering his voice, he spoke almost in a whisper.
I see. Well, then I suppose I'll take a walk.
Without looking back, Nox rushed through the brush at the edge of the village and into the northern woods. As he left, he didn't see Jaya looking after him with an incredulous expression, nor did he hear what she said in a low voice as he walked away.
I didn't say no, so you're supposed to fight for me, Nox. You're not supposed to give up so easily. I suppose some males don't understand females at all.
Nox ran through the woods, at first following one of the paths. After a few moments, though, he heard the sound of metal clashing against metal. It was coming from somewhere about 100 paces or so off the path. Plunging through the brush, Nox headed in the direction of the noise, intent on finding out what it was. His leggings protected his lower body from thorns and brambles. His bare upper body, though, was soon covered in little scratches. He heard a voice from up ahead and slowed down a bit to listen.
You kinda murdered me, but at least I getting a good prank on ya for dying. Hacking new to the stone breakster in the sky.
As he burst out of the brush and into a forest clearing, he heard another shout from a second voice. This one was almost right in front of him.
Stupid little piece of shit.
As he took in the scene in front of him, Nox saw 2 individuals fighting, both of other races. He recognized one as an Urusk, what some people called fawns. It was shorter than him, only high enough to reach his chest, or a bit over 2 ells, he estimated. Above the waist, the Urusk looked something like a human who spent a great deal of time in the light of the greater sun, except for the horns sticking through his curly mane of hair, that is. The brownish tinge was quite similar in shade to his own, he realized, once he took a good look. Below the waist, the Urusk had thick fur, which almost made it look like he was wearing shaggy trousers. As he looked at the creature, Nox could see that, but for a sheath on a belt, the Urusk wore no other clothing or armor. The fur was just that, fur, not clothing. A spear was protruding from the Urusk's chest, but he held on to the spear and swung a short sword at his opponent. Facing the Urusk was a being Nox realized must have been a Merca. The Merca was monkey-like in appearance, but unlike a monkey, he had less fur on his toned humanoid torso. The monkey man had long arms, his large hands held the spear lodged in the fawn's chest. The Merca also wore armored sleeves over his arms and shoulders. These connected with each other across the upper back by a strap, but the rest of his torso was otherwise bare. The armored sleeves each had a diamond-shaped piece of jade embedded in the shoulder. Below the waist, the Merca wore a pair of baggy trousers, a set of loin armor, and funny-looking boots. The boots appeared designed for his monkey-like feet. He also had a belt and 2 large sheathed blades. They were of a size where he wasn't sure if he should call them large daggers or short swords. Nox had only a couple of seconds to take all this in before the Urusk managed to swing his sword at the Merca. The blade struck around the shoulder area, but the Merca must have not been injured. He took little notice of this, and it didn't seem to slow him down. Kicking the Urusk brutally in the abdomen, he pulled the spear out of its chest. The Urusk gurgled as blood came pouring from his mouth, and he collapsed to the ground. Nox gaped in shock at what he was seeing. He had seen people die before, usually due to accidents or illnesses. Once he had seen a dreadcock strike off the head of a trainer. He had never seen one sentient being brutally kill another, though. He had no time to process it either, for the Merca now turned toward Nox and held out his spear in a challenge.
You! Where did you come from?
The Merca growled.
Never mind, you're dead.
The Merca leapt forward, swinging his spear in a wide arc toward Nox.
Ah!
Nox leapt backward in terror. Almost immediately he winced at a fiery pain across his upper chest. The tip of the Merca's spear had left a deep scratch. Nox dropped his own spear as he tripped over a root. He only managed to keep his feet because he ran into a tree as he staggered backward. A jutting branch of the tree scratched his hip above his leggings. As he cried out, he saw the tip of the spear coming straight for his face. He ducked to one side, the spear nicking his ear before going into the tree behind him with a loud thunk. He was now angry. This blasted monkey was trying to kill him. The Merca was now right in front of him, trying to dislodge his spear from the tree. Nox now reached out and grabbed one of the Merca's large daggers from its sheath. The monkey man's eyes widened with terror, and he pulled with all his might to try to dislodge his spear from the tree. It was too late for him, and Nox pulled the dagger free from the sheath. As he did this, he carried the motion across the Merca's abdomen, and the intestines spilled out onto the ground. The Merca reached out and grabbed Nox by the ankle, croaking,
I'll kill you!
This was his last gasp, and he let out his final breath and died. Nox stood where he was for several minutes, in shock from the experience. Finally, he shook himself.
I'm alive!
It was an amazing feeling. He'd faced death in battle for the first time and come through it mostly intact. Catching his breath, Nox frowned, then pulled the belt with the sheathed daggers off the Merca. He wiped off the blood as best he could and headed back to the village.
There should be a reward for this find,
Nox thought as he left the woods for the council tent. As Nox approached the tent of the clan council, he took a deep breath. Then he burst through the flap into the interior. For a moment, all was silent as the members of the council stared at him with disapproving glances. Finally, after a moment, Atu Nowehan spoke.
Nox, what is the meaning of this interruption?
Ignoring his brother, Nox turned toward the Bihan, the chief of his clan and high chief of the tribe. He held the daggers high.
Hesko Vihan, I have fought a warrior in the woods outside the village and triumphed. These are some of the weapons I recovered.
Nox's face was flush with excitement. He stuck out his wounded chest, proudly showing off his first battle scar. Meturatan, son of the Vihan, frowned at Nox in disapproval.
Taksat Solen, were you given permission to leave the village again? Permission?
Nox looked over at Meturatan in surprise.
I didn't realize I needed it. No,
Hesko Vihan now held up a hand to silence Nox, and then spoke, his words sounding mushy due to his lack of teeth.
Enough, Tishyatsi. This is troubling. Tell us where this happened, and we will recover the rest so we can destroy them.
Nox's mouth dropped open for a moment, so surprised was he at what he now heard.
Destroy them? But, Vihan, these weapons are far greater than anything we have. We should... Lan! You dare challenge the authority of the Vihan?
Atu Noehan's voice was stern.
Leave now. Go back to Aunt Wainoka. You are clearly not ready to be a man, as you cannot follow direction.
Hesko Vihan nodded, speaking again.
We must hold to the ancient traditions. We will destroy these accursed abominations of metal. Go home, boy. Leave the weapons. I forbid you from leaving your home again, except to bathe and do your assigned work, until I tell you otherwise. Continue to be obstinate, and you face banishment.
Tears coming unbidden to his eyes, Nox hung his head and slunk from the tent. As his aunt cleaned the deep scratch on his chest, Nox fumed. After leaving the council tent, he had gone down to the creek, washed himself, and then gone home. Still unclothed, he sat cross-legged on the floor, as his aunt tended to his injuries.
Ow, that stings!
He winced as his aunt dabbed a piece of linen soaked in alcohol over the deep scratch on his hip.
It has to hurt if it's to heal. This one will be okay without a bandage, though. Now, stand up.
As he got to his feet, Nox changed the subject, returning to the Vihan's decision about the weapons.
He speaks as if metal is an abomination. We use metal cords for breaking dreadcocks, though, not to mention metal knives. What's wrong with longer blades? And how is it not hypocrisy?
He now winced again as his aunt cleaned the wound on his chest. Wainoka shook her head.
Nox, I don't know why we shun swords. I doubt anyone does. It's tradition.
Nox grunted.
Stupid tradition.
Before Wainoka could reply, the door flap flew open. None other than Chelana Viha swept into the dwelling. Nox gaped, surprised to see the medicine woman. She rarely left her own hut these days, what with her advanced age. He couldn't remember her ever dropping in on people. His aunt, who had known Chelana Viha when she was younger and more mobile, also looked surprised.
Chelana Viha, what an unexpected surprise. What brings the medicine woman to my batsa today?
The old woman pointed at Nox as she spoke.
With the owl, my matter lies.
Nox gulped as he got to his feet. He already had the Vihan angry at him today. Was the Viha also going to chew him out now? He looked up at her sheepishly, almost wincing at an expected angry reply.
What is it, Chelana Viha?
The medicine woman didn't snap at Nox. Instead, she pulled something from her satchel that Nox couldn't see well. Whatever it was, she put it between her remaining teeth and snapped it in two. Chewing on half, she threw the other half to the floor and ground it into the fresh earth of the hut with her bare foot. Closing her eyes, she took in a deep breath. Next, she blew a wisp of whitish-blue smoke from her wrinkly, puckered lips. Taking another deep breath, she inhaled the smoke through her nostrils. Her eyes snapped open as she seemed to stare off into the distance. What was she seeing? Although there was nothing to see inside the dwelling. Her eyes had turned a milky blue color, like the smoke she'd inhaled. At this point, it occurred to Nox that he was still naked, and he started to reach for his loincloth to put it on, but then the medicine woman lifted her arms into the air. One hand bore her old, feathered staff. Her eyes seemed to stare straight through him, while at the same time demanding his attention. He instead ignored the garment for the moment and stood up straight again as he focused on her words.
Beware!
She cried out.
False wisdom! The fetter must be broken, the future to find. Dark visions, dusk approaches. The dawn of the Duskbringer is at hand. Future unclear. Prepare!
Nox narrowed his eyes, confused. This was not what he had expected. "Prepare!" The Viha now turned and faced Nox, swinging her staff around and jabbing him in the chest with the blunt end. Nox winced, more in surprise than pain.
Owl yields not to snake, harrying harbinger of darkness to distant strands. Duskbringer bites moon.
The medicine woman now pulled a large egg from her satchel, crushing it in her left hand. The yolk fell and pooled on the floor beside her bare foot.
Flood unleashed. Death of innocents are on his hands. The owl challenges the one who brings the darkness.
What was Chelanaviha talking about? Nox was now completely confused, but part of what the medicine woman said sent a shiver down his spine. He had dreamed he was an owl fighting a snake, and now she was talking about the same thing. What were the odds of that? If her visions were somehow tied to his dreams, he had a feeling he was the owl. If so, he had to fight the snake, but what did it all mean? He was not a literal owl, so was the snake also not literal? He cleared his throat.
Chelanaviha, you say I must fight someone. Who? With what?
The old woman now placed one of her long fingernails against his bare shoulder. He flinched as she began to slowly draw it across the skin. It scored him lightly and stung a bit, but the scratch wasn't deep enough to draw blood.
Fox sees his eggs, even if he must go against his own.
Was Nox hearing her right? It sounded like she wanted him to go against some of his own people to seize something with which to fight. But what? Then it hit him. The Urusk and Merka weapons, that had to be it. He looked Chelanaviha in the eyes, noticing they had returned to their usual dark brown color, and spoke. You wish me to take the weapons of the outsiders, to go against the chief? Chelanaviha now placed her sharp fingernail against his bare chest. She pressed hard, making Nox yelp in pain. She seemed to take no notice of his discomfort, though, as she spoke again.
Stubborn is the ass, yet resolute in his ways. Heed my sayings, young one.
The medicine woman now bent over and scooped up the fresh dirt. As she did, she mingled it with the yolk and dried blue powder mushroom she'd crushed into it earlier. Swaying back and forth as she ground the mixture in her hands, she chanted words Nox could not quite make out. Her voice was throaty and guttural as she tossed the concoction into the air. It showered down over Nox's head, sparkling with a blue light as it settled on his white hair. The medicine woman, now looking quite weary and drained of energy, turned away. Without saying a word, she opened the door flap and was gone. Nox now sank down into a seated position on a three-legged stool nearby. As he pondered what transpired, Winoka came up next to him and placed a hand on his shoulder.
What's on your mind?
Chelanaviha may not be clear, but I'm sure she means me to take the weapons and armor. If I do, though, I go against the Vihan and cannot stay. He's already on the verge of banishing me as things stand. Nox frowned again as another thought occurred to him. You know, Chelanaviha is the only member of the tribe who has never teased me about my hair. I have never understood why. Winoka smiled.
Your great-grandparents were her favorite aunt and uncle when she was young. Your grandmother was also her best friend.
Which grandmother? The one with the light hair?
Yes, exactly. Asha was her name. Your father's mother and mine.
Nox's eyes widened. I never knew that.
Well, it's the truth.
Winoka smiled. Nox nodded, then grew quiet as he considered the ramifications of going up against the chief. It would mean exile for sure. He'd never been apart from his people before, and had never felt the urge to leave his homeland. He was not like his great-grandfather, who had traveled the world and brought back a bride. He looked up at a tapestry on the wall that represented them and frowned. Something else, Chelanaviha said, seemed more clear now. Distant strands. She said, distant strands. She knows I must leave. Winoka nodded.
I suspected as much.
Are you okay with this? If you don't want me to go, I will forget about the prophecy. Obey the Vihan.
Quelle canina! I'll even try to get along with Atu.
Winoka shook her head.
Nox, I would be lying if I said I want you to go, but I've never known Chelanaviha to be wrong. If you mean to go, I won't stop you, and you go with my blessing.
Nox said nothing for a moment, then grabbed his loincloth from where it hung on a peg nearby. He put it on, followed by his boots. He now looked over at Winoka, his expression grim.
This is something I have to do, Auntie. I didn't tell you before, but I had a dream last night in which I was an owl, and I fought a serpent. I believe Chelanaviha's vision is real, and I have to follow it where it leads me.
Tears had come unbidden to his eyes as he spoke, and he now wiped them with his hand as he got to his feet. Winoka now spoke in a low voice.
I always knew you were meant for greatness, Nox. I'll miss you. When will you leave?
Is it dark outside yet?
Yes.
Then I should start right away. Most of the village will be at the festival, so there will never be a better time. Winoka folded her arms around him in an embrace and whispered in his ear.
Be careful, Nox.
I will. Winoka held him out at arm's length for a moment, then sadly kissed his lips as tears poured down her face. After a moment she spoke again, her voice almost a whisper.
Nox, I loved your uncle, and he loved me, but we could never have a child. Then you came into my life, and you filled that void as nothing else could. I love you, Nox, as if you were my own son. You were Chamanto's comfort to me when I cried out about the lost children I could never bear. I love you too, and as far as I'm concerned, I am your son, Aunt Winoka. You are my Kenima.
Tears were now pouring down his own face, and he kissed her lips once more. Then Nox pulled open the door flap and headed out into the night. Wearing only his boots and loincloth, Nox skirted the edge of the village, keeping to the shadows. Using cover and concealment, he was soon approaching the guard post. This was situated at the edge of the woods, but also on the bank of the creek. Earlier, when he'd left the council tent, he'd gone down to the creek to bathe. While there, he'd seen some of the council members. They had approached the guard post and dropped off the Urusk and Merka weapons. He knew then that was where he needed to go to retrieve them. Most of the village had gone to the festival. Would there even be any guards on duty? Nox was initially hopeful, but as he approached the guard post, he saw this was a false hope. 2 guards were still on duty. How was he going to get past them? As he pondered this, he heard a loud squawk from the dreadcock's pens nearby and had an idea. Slipping into one of the pens, he called out to one of the dreadcocks in a whisper,
Gouger, come here, boy.
Gouger was one of the more ferocious dreadcocks. He'd earned his name for obvious propensities, and was Atunowihan's mount. Most other members of Nox's tribe were frightened of Gouger. While Gouger feared Atunowihan and showed him deference, he liked Nox. This was likely because Nox gave him rodents and other small scavengers he killed in the village. Leaving the pen with Gouger, Nox crept through the high grass again. Soon he was a handful of paces from the guard post. The night was dark. Nisha was visible in the sky. The faint light from the moon, though, which was full at present, was dim, especially since both of the suns had set. One of the guards was grumbling.
Hachko, I'm so bored. We had to miss the festival for this. Shut your Hachkota mouth. I heard something.
Nox froze as he heard the second guard speak. He had been moving quietly, but it was time to set his plan in motion. He now leaned in next to the giant bird and whispered,
Treat by the river.
That was all the dreadcock needed to hear. It was far from intelligent, but it did recognize the words treat and river. As soon as the words left Nox's mouth, Gouger took off. Reaching the creek, the dreadcock ran along the bank, right past the guard post and toward the river. The guards immediately noticed, and the serious one now pointed toward Gouger.
How did he get loose? Come on, we have to catch him, or Atunowihan will have our Inbaksana on a platter.
The guards rushed off, chasing Gouger, and Nox quietly slipped into the guard post. The dead bodies of the Urusk and Merka were still lying there, not yet buried. Both bodies had been stripped of clothing and armor. Nox paid the bodies no heed, instead focusing on the weapons and armor. He was immediately drawn to the belt with the large blades and sheaths. Picking it up, he set it to one side and then assessed the armor. He now looked at the monkey man and his gear, which interested him more. The trousers and armored sleeves of the merca fit him fine, as did the loin armor. The boots seemed to be much sturdier than his own footwear, but were not designed for his type of feet. They were also much bigger, so he kept his own footwear, which still had soft soles and were good for stealth. Keeping on his bembatsa, he put on the merca trousers over them, and then the loin armor. Strapping on the armored sleeves and the belt with the daggers, he grabbed the merca spear and was ready to go. With a determined stride, he walked into the woodline and left Talwakya Tikyanwatik behind. He had only traveled a few hundred paces into the woods when he heard shouting back in the village. They must have discovered the gear was missing. He picked up the pace but heard shouts coming closer and closer. Soon it seemed they were coming from all around him. Then he heard a clear shout from less than 50 paces behind him. He recognized from the voice that it was his brother, Atunowehan.
There he is!